Hey, Jefferson Calico here. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about women in Islam. So this is a controversial subject perhaps at times, or maybe better, misunderstood subject. Your book does have a section on women's roles in Islam, but what I'd like to do is just begin by introducing you to a few important, famous women in Islam. So there is really an important female aspect to Islamic history and Islamic spirituality. So, 4 famous and important Islamic women. Alright, so the first one, of course, is Khadijah. This is the Prophet Muhammad's first wife and dearly beloved in Islam. There's Khadijah is a very common name in the Islamic world for women in the Islamic world. It's because the wife of Muhammad, the first wife of Muhammad, Khadijah, is so dearly beloved. She's really seen as the mother of the faithful, and she is just seen as providing. She was the first one to believe Muhammad and support him, and so she was this very caring and nurturing figure in Muhammad's life during the early years in Mecca when being a Muslim was so difficult. She really stood by Muhammad and supported him in many ways. And so for all these reasons, she's just a dearly beloved figure. So the second one I'd like to introduce you to is Aisha. And she was a later wife of Muhammad, and she's she's famous and important in Islam, especially for her role in putting together the hadith, which are those narrated accounts of Muhammad's life, his sunnah, his example, that are such an important source in Islam. So she is known as an expert in the hadith and contributed more hadith than anyone else, and was influential in compiling those. She was known to be someone who was very intelligent, had this great memory, was a very dear companion to the Prophet, and was also a leader after Muhammad's death, was a very well-respected leader within the Islamic community. So that's really her claim to fame. Now, there is some controversy, of course, so she's probably the most controversial woman in Islam, perhaps, and that's primarily because she was married to Muhammad at a young age. And this has generated quite a bit of controversy in the West. Most of it probably overblown from my perspective, at least. But there's this idea that Muhammad, this was an arranged marriage between Muhammad and Aisha, and so there's this idea that this contributes to the problem of child marriage in certain parts of the Islamic world. So child marriage is definitely a problem in certain parts of the world, and these are really horrible circumstances, generally among very rural and uneducated types of populations, of course, but these are really horrible situations in which these very young girls are married off in these arranged marriages and treated really no better than slaves, and have pretty bad lives. There's just a couple things I'd like to discuss about that. First is the evidence itself for the age of Aisha at the time of the marriage. So there's a hadith that states that she was 9 at the time of the marriage. Now that would be problematic, right? I mean, we would have issues with that kind of a marriage, and we ought to say that that's not something that, in our culture at least, would be, or really any culture, that we could approve of. But the fact is that there's one hadith that supports that. There's other evidence that argues that perhaps she was older. But in any case, even if she was 9, if you are basing this whole sort of civilizational practice of child marriage on this tiny shred of evidence and say, oh, because Muhammad married Aisha at a young age, then I can force young women, young girls into marriage, if you're basing that whole practice on one tiny shred of evidence, this is a very poorly supported practice, and you can hardly say that it's Islamic. And in fact, of course, child marriage preceded Islam. Unfortunately, it continues in many parts of the world, but there's very little evidence from the Islamic tradition to support a whole civilizational practice of child marriage. Okay. And the second simply is the quality of life that Aisha had. So by all accounts, Aisha was hardly some sort of a abused child slave, basically slave wife. In fact, she was, by all accounts, she was very well respected, had a very loving and caring relationship with Muhammad, and had much freedom, much privilege, and hardly a child slave. So if you are trying to compare these, you can't look at the relationship between Aisha and Muhammad and say that somehow this supports this horrible practice of basically child slavery, this child wife slavery that's actually being practiced in these sort of remote areas of the world. Okay, so a couple more very important female figures in Islamic history. Just another one I'd like to mention is Rabia, who was a very important early mystic in Islam, very well beloved, and she really introduced this whole idea in Islamic mysticism or Sufism, of loving God and relating to God through this dynamic of love. So, okay, and as a fourth example, I'll just mention Queen Rania of Jordan. She is a very well-educated, she's far from a child bride. She's very intelligent, highly educated, very articulate. She's become an outspoken leader in the fields of education and healthcare for people, public education, healthcare, expanded roles for women. So she has enunciated very strong. She's a strong, outspoken critic of radical Islam and a strong proponent of a very moderate, cosmopolitan form of Islam. So she's also very well respected all around the world. Very important figure. So Muhammad clearly deplored the status and quality of life that women had in his society, where they were treated basically, they basically were property, traded off, treated badly, without any sort of restraints on how they could be treated. So Muhammad thought this was awful, and he saw Islam. He saw this new revelation from God as coming in as a liberating force in some sense, and raising up the status of women in the community. So lifting them up from like this degrading quality of life they had, and giving them equality in the community, new freedoms, and new social power. So for instance, the right to own property, especially the dowry, which is really seen and is described in the Quran as the woman's property that can never be taken from her. So the right to own property. This is something that women in the Christian world wouldn't get for over 1,000 years. Marriage and to give a woman more power in the marriage, the right to divorce, and then this strong sense of women being equal to men before God in God's sight. And so here's a verse, a very important verse from Surah 33 that supports that. Indeed, the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the obedient men and the obedient women, the truthful men and truthful women, the patient men and the patient women, the humble men and the humble women, the charitable men and the charitable women, the fasting men and the fasting women, the men who guard their private parts, that's modesty, modest men and modest women, and the men who remember Allah often, and the women who do so. For them, Allah, or God, has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. So what we see in this very important verse is just that equality of men and women that it lays out. Women are full participants in the religion and are also fully equal in the sight of God, and both men and women have this same reward, forgiveness and the great reward of paradise. So Muhammad and the New Revelation, the Quran, seem to be expressing this very progressive stance towards women and women's roles. At the same time, in Islam, there is an important emphasis on family and an important emphasis on the differences between men and women. So differing roles within the family. But the family is really seen as, in Islam, as sacrosanct. It's the most important institution in society. And this nurturing, caring, mothering role of women is very, very important as this anchor point of the family, and women are really seen that it's really the duty and the responsibility of women then to make sure that their household is this place of peace, of wholeness and integrity and comfort and nurture. So this is very important. And within that thinking about women, then there's also this emphasis on the power of women's female sexuality and the corresponding need for modesty. Now, in that context then, these laws and traditions that had provided for more freedom and power for women at the beginning of Islam then were often, not always, but often as Islam progressed, were often interpreted in ways that began to be more restrictive and limit the freedom of women. So for instance, we get something like Saudi Arabia, right, where the Islamic tradition is interpreted in ways that are very restrictive, so that women have to be covered, fully covered with the niqab generally in Saudi Arabia. They only go outside of the home with by being escorted by a close male relative and not allowed to drive. And so that's very sort of a restrictive and conservative interpretation. But there's also more liberal and more progressive interpretations of that Quranic tradition. So we can see this range of interpretation in something like the traditional women's covering in Islam. So a very modern, progressive Muslim woman might not wear a head covering at all. As you saw, for instance, in the picture of Queen Rania, she normally wouldn't wear a head covering except perhaps at the mosque or if she's with conservative religious figures. So the most common type of head covering is the hijab. That's what the one you see on the left, and it is it wraps mainly around covers the hair and the neck, leaving the face exposed. And this is you may see a woman on Somerset campus, for instance, wearing a hijab. This is not necessarily seen as restrictive, but often for Muslim women in the West, they wear the hijab as with a real sense of pride, showing who they are and taking pride in their Muslim identity and religion. So the next one, second from the left, there is the niqab. And that is a full body covering that leaves the eyes exposed. And this is common, especially in Saudi Arabia, on the Arabian Peninsula in a very conservative religious setting. So, in the middle we have the burqa, and this is very rarely worn in the Islamic world, only in the most extremely conservative, even radical areas of Islam. It's really hard to argue that this isn't abusive to women. It involves a full body covering in which even the eyes are veiled. The two on the right are basically just a longer and shorter form of the chador, which is very common in Iran and Shiite areas, conservative Shiite areas, and it basically consists of a robe or a sheet, basically, that you just drape around your head and covers the body, and you hold there at the neck. So on one hand, it seems to be very restrictive. I mean, it does fully cover the woman's form, yet at the same time, it's very easy to take on and take off. You can just sort of drape it around you as you walk out the door, and when you come back in, then you can just hang it up. So this just sort of shows the range of possible interpretations from no veil to a very restrictive veil that are available through interpreting the Islamic tradition in different ways. But we also should mention that sort of more restrictive and limited role only really became clear and problematic once there were these dramatic changes in women's lives in the West, in Europe and the United States, really beginning in the early 1900s. And once women's lives in the West begin to dramatically change, their roles, their dress, their relationship to the family, and as all these things began to change very rapidly within the last 100 years, then that the tradition and conservative interpretation of women's roles that remained in Islam became very apparent, especially to Western observers. So I wanted to show you one more passage from the Quran before we stop. This is from Surah An-Nisa, Surah 4, chapter 4 in the Quran, verse 34 and 35. Men are in charge of women by what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend from their wealth. So basically, men are over women because they financially support women. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard, that is, taking care of the home while their husband is away. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and then finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand. And if you fear dissension between the two, then send an arbitrator from his people and an arbitrator from her people. If they both desire reconciliation, Allah will cause it between them. Indeed, Allah is ever knowing and acquainted with all things. So no doubt the first thing you'll notice about this passage is that it sanctions or seems to sanction striking or beating wives. It clearly says that, and there's no doubt that especially in a conservative interpretation, it has been taken literally in that sense and has been used to sanction or support the abuse of women. However, let's look at it in its context and see if we can come to understand this a little bit better. So, first of all, this passage concerns the home and the peace of the home, which, as we mentioned earlier, is sacrosanct in Islam. It's one of the most important values, the peaceful home. And if that peace is threatened by some sort of marital conflict, then this verse attempts to address that issue so that peace can be returned to the home. And then the second thing you'll notice is that there's a process here. So the verse says, first advise, that's talk to. talk with the wife who seems to be arrogant or out of place. So first, talk or advise. And then forsake them in bed. So that's something like what? Give them the silent treatment, basically, right? And then only then, after these other things have been tried, then finally beat or strike them. But again, all these things are only temporary and only temporary strategies, because it says once they obey you, that is, once peace is reestablished, then all these must stop and the relationship must be harmonious and loving to the extent possible. So beating or striking then is only the very last resort when nothing else has worked to bring peace to the home. But we should also note that many, if not most, Islamic commentators on the Quran have looked at this passage and said that whatever this means, it doesn't mean that you can beat somebody up. Beat or strike here doesn't mean abuse or beat up. That what it means is something like slap you with a wet noodle, something like that. Just a light physical chastisement. Now, that still doesn't sound good to us, but think about the context in which this verse, this passage is spoken, right? So it's spoken into this situation in Arabia at the time where a husband could do anything he wanted to with his wife. He could beat her to death for no reason and without any consequence, for that matter. So when you consider that context, then what you see here is something actually very progressive, which is meant to forestall or even eliminate this easy sort of abuse of women that was predominant in this pre-Muslim society. So here, instead of just using extreme violence as the first option, Muhammad is really trying to step in and really turn this society around 180 degrees to get men to see their wives in a very new way, and to treat them with much more respect and dignity. But even there, that's not the end of the story. It's not as if it's left in the husband's hands to deal with it however he wants. The Quran doesn't leave the husband or the man in this situation as sort of a tyrant over his wife and his family. Because if you see a marriage falling into conflict, then the community or the family has this charge to bring in an arbitrator. So someone who's going to represent the husband's perspective and someone who represents the wife's perspective. And so it's taken out of the husband's hands at this point, and both parties are equally represented. Their interests are both promoted here in a way, and then that negotiation happens to try to find a reasonable settlement. So this is actually quite a sophisticated process, especially if you consider that this is happening in the 600 CE. So it's quite a sophisticated, actually, process. I don't know about you, but this seems way better than a couple airing all their dirty laundry on divorce court on national TV or something like that. I also think it's interesting here that you really can't fault the Muslim community here, the Muslim tradition, for really taking seriously the issue of marital conflict. Because guess what? It does happen. It is a serious issue. And the spirit here of Islam is wanting peace. Peace between husband and wife. Peace in the home. And you can't fault them for that. But not only that, and if you compare this, for instance, to the Christian tradition, I'm not sure you find a similar approach in the Christian scriptures, for instance, that really focuses very directly on this issue of marital conflict and lays out this very practical process for how to resolve a conflict in the home, marital conflict, in a way that seeks after this sort of peace and stability. So that's worth considering. Hey, so thanks a lot. That's just a little brief look at the women in Islam, a little bit about the history and the roles and some of the controversy, and a few of the verses in the tradition that are important to this discussion. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.